For those who are back, welcome back. For those who are joining us for the first time, we always kick things off with our show where we pay homage and respect to the land in which CSUSB sits on by paying our land acknowledgement. And it goes, we recognize that California State University of San Bernardino sits on the territorial and ancestral land of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians. We recognize that every member of the California State University of San Bernardino's community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold CSUSB more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous people. So we thank you. And now at this time, we pass things over to my co-host Yvette, where she talks about things that's going on in the recent news across the nation. So Yvette.
Hello. So we got some information coming out of Cook County, Illinois. So the Cook County Democratic Committee voted against endorsements of presiding Judge Michael Tumlin. Why? Tumlin is responsible for upholding the detention of youth under 13 because, according to him, banning it conflicted with Illinois law. And he is also responsible for misinterpreting Chief Judge Timothy's orders so inaccurately that it became nearly impossible for youth to seek help and legal protection during the pandemic. And Evans even had to reissue an order to clarify. Cook County judges have faced tougher retention campaigns in recent years. There was Judge Matthew Coughlin in 2018, whose wrongful convictions thwarted an endorsement for another 6 years on the bench. There was Mauricio Arroyo, whose sexual misconduct allegations stopped his endorsement. A perspective shift from incoming committee people may be to thank for greater critical analysis of judges, especially in the midst of ongoing demands for reform in the justice system as it pertains to Black, Indigenous people of color. According to one of Judge Tumlin's own colleagues, Judge Tumlin is one of the judges that truly upholds white supremacy and this punitive system that we have through his actions on this court. And so that was a quote by his colleague, Ugo Okiri, Deputy Committeeman for the 25th Ward. He even asserts that he is fueling the mass incarceration system that puts Black and brown people in jail at disproportionate rates. So what we can really get from this is that hopefully moving forward, especially with elections coming up, we have more critical analysis of judges, of chiefs, of deputies, people who are a part of the system, who determine what the system looks like for us, for people of color. So make sure you vote because you really can determine what happens to our community. And that's all I have for y'all.
Thank you, Yvette. And now we are going to jump into our show. Matter of fact, before we jump into our show, Stan, if you have any news to update us with as well, we would be much obliged.
The only news I have is the update on the, I'm sorry, I just drew a blank.
Breonna Taylor's?
Breonna Taylor's, yes. The officer that shot the wall is going to be convicted, and the other two that shot Breonna Taylor are going to go free. And I think that's a sad day for our court system and what's going on in the world. So that's what I have to offer. Thank you.
Yeah, every day we're seeing the different injustices and the failures of our justice system. So it's definitely eye-widening to see where do we go from here following these different cases. So thank you, Stan, for bringing that to us. As I mentioned before, we have a very special week, very special episode and conversations on race and policing. Today's topic will be on white supremacy and militia extremists in police departments. We have a very, very special panel for you all today. And as always, don't forget to spike that Q&A button at the bottom of your screens there, as questions may pop up in your head, or if it doesn't even pertain to today's show, just things that's recently going on in your community or within your families, or just questions that you may have for our panelists today, and as well as us hosts. we could definitely tackle those and get some answers. That's what we're all about. We're in a safe space, and we're here to conversate and continue to push these agendas to make sure that justice is for all. So without further ado, white supremacists and militia extremists in police departments, we're going to be first introducing Professor Vida Johnson. So we want to welcome her. And Vida, prior to joining Georgetown University Law Center, she was supervising attorney in the trial division at Public Defender Service for the District of Columbia. So we're definitely all ears for Vida today. So welcome, Professor Johnson.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here. I'm from California, so I'm happy to be talking to all of you. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. And, you know, I think today is a good day to have this conversation in light of the news about Breonna Taylor. Marlo, should I go straight into my talk, or are we going to introduce the other folks first?
We'll go straight into you, and then we'll bring the others in.
Okay, great. So I wanted to just give you a little background about why and how I became interested in this topic. In 1967, before I was born, members of the KKK bombed my grandfather's, the parsonage of my grandfather's church in Laurel, Mississippi. And the dining room and the kitchen were damaged, but fortunately no one was hurt. And so I grew up hearing about the KKK and other people who held explicitly racist beliefs. When this bombing took place, my mother was an adult. She was already living in California. And so even though I grew up with this story, it also seemed very far away to me. You know, for me, it took place in the Deep South while I was in California, and it took place before I was born. So it was a problem of another time and another place. But nevertheless, I think that experience and my grandfather's work in the civil rights movement drew me to doing criminal defense work. And, you know, through that work, especially, I saw so much institutional racism in our criminal legal system. And so I was at Georgetown teaching and working on a different article when the news in Charlottesville happened. This is 2017. There were white supremacists on a college campus, and there was also a T-shirt that a police officer wore to court in DC that featured a white supremacist icon and a angel of death and a police badge and rifle. And so those two things happening together made me want to see what sorts of connections that I could find between modern policing and white supremacy and racial animus more generally. But before I start talking about that research, I just want to pause and acknowledge that there is a very long history of white supremacy and police departments. Some of the very first police departments in the United States were police departments in the South that were groups of white men who were tasked with grabbing enslaved people and making it their business to know what they were doing and where they were going. And of course, police departments across the country allowed the lynchings of thousands of people without any white people being held to account for those murders. And, you know, there have been a number of scandals involving white supremacist police on police departments, even in the 90s. There was a scandal involving white supremacists that targeted Black and Latino residents in 25 years ago in the LAPD. In Cleveland, Ohio in 1999, there were Nazi symbols found in every precinct there. There were Texas officers who were members of the KKK in the 90s that were fired after trying to recruit just one more officer on their chapter. But my research has been targeted from 2008 till the election of from the election of Barack Obama until now. So I'm going to share screen and show some slides to you. Okay. All right. So, you know, we think about explicit bias, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. And I want to also say there's a lot of talk about implicit bias, and that's a very important conversation. I think people feel much more comfortable thinking about things that are done unconsciously and are much more likely to receive those messages when they think about implicit bias on police departments, but we haven't focused enough about explicit bias in police departments. And that's why I'm so glad that we have so many of you joining us today. Okay, why am I starting with this slide? I want to start with this slide to show you what's happening on college campuses. So this is a photograph of a group, an organization called Identity Europa. And they're a white supremacist organization, and it is their mission to recruit college students. Okay, and you can see, you know, I joke that this guy right in the middle in the back probably served me a craft cocktail at some bar, right? Like, these are very clean cut people that fit in. They're not wearing hoods, you know, they don't fit into the normal stereotype that we have of who racists are and what they look like. This organization doesn't exist anymore. They've rebranded. I think they're now called the American Identity Movement. But they're in my hometown. They're at San Diego State University. I live in DC now. They're at University of Maryland. So they've made their presence known by recruiting on all college campuses. They were founded by this guy who is a former member of the military, and I think there's a lot of evidence that white supremacists have infiltrated our military, and that's really scary. So why am I talking about this? Well, because in most big cities, police officers are required to have either 2 years of military experience or 2 years of college. And so we know that these other institutions from which police officers are drawn have white supremacists in their ranks. So it's not a surprise for us to imagine that there are white supremacist police officers. And there was a poll in 2017 of Americans where 10% of them said that it was acceptable to hold white supremacist or neo-Nazi views. That's 10% of people who were willing to say that to a stranger over the phone. So we have to imagine that there are at least that number, if not a higher number, of police officers who hold those views as well. Okay, all right, so I'm just going to scroll through some slides so you can see how many stories there are about police officers who hold these types of views. This is the guy in the black is a police officer, or was a police officer in Louisiana. The guy in the top corner here was a police officer in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So this is, you know, it's not just Louisiana, Philly, you know, it's like a 2-hour drive from here. These are from where I am in DC, but you know, these are police officers in big cities. He was at a Black Lives Matter protest in 2016. This guy is Bert Alstook, who is one of the most influential white supremacists in the country. He's the owner of a white supremacist website, record label, had appeared in multiple documentaries, and he was the police chief of the town that he was in. And so it's officers at all ranks, not just you know, low-level officers who are new to the force. This story made the news just last year. A Michigan police officer was terminated after a black couple was looking for a new home, and they found Confederate flags and a KKK application that was framed in this officer's house. I mean, he didn't even bother to take it down for prospective buyers. So those are officers who identify as white supremacists, but there's a whole other category of officers that I think it's so important to be thinking about, who don't necessarily identify as white supremacists, but hold those views. They hold racial animus but they don't realize that that's what it is. And I'm going to show you a bunch of slides that sort of show this sort of attitude that I think is very prevalent in police departments, much more prevalent than people who are actually members of the KKK or other hate groups. So you can see this is Miami, you know, a very culturally diverse and ethnically diverse area. Police officers, there's a big scandal there. Police officers texting back and forth, or actually emailing back and forth, racist jokes and other things. So you see this is Black Monopoly, and every square says go to jail. There was a texting scandal in San Francisco where police officers there said all sorts of racist and homophobic things. Again, so San Francisco, Miami, these places that we don't think of as politically conservative, where we don't imagine that there are lots of, there's a lot of racial animus. This is an officer, I want to say New York, I've forgotten at this point. This one is from Louisiana. This monkey theme is something that we've seen a lot of, referring to Black people as monkeys. This one I find to be, I don't know, somehow the most upsetting to me. The idea, you can see in the bottom left corner, when your daughter's first Negro crush is your daughter's first crush is a little Negro boy, and it's a white mother drowning her daughter in a bathtub. I mean, the fact that this guy posted this on his Facebook is just, you know, so demoralizing. Okay. And just in 2020, I added a couple of new ones. San Jose police officer said, let's repurpose hijabs into nooses on a private Facebook group. I'm sure you've heard the story about the police in Wilmington, North Carolina. A bunch of officers were talking amongst themselves. Someone had accidentally activated his body-worn camera, and through a chance audit of their body-worn camera system, another officer heard this reported conversation amongst a couple of officers, or I think it was 4 officers, where they called for a race war. You can, they use the N-word repeatedly in the conversation. You can see this headline at the bottom, we're just gonna go out and start slaughtering them. There was a quote about how we were gonna set them back for generations, referring to the Black community. And this was all in the wake of the George Floyd protests that this conversation took place. So this was just, I think, just in June. And then I just included this story because, you know, I'm from San Diego, and National City is a suburb of San Diego. And someone had posted on Twitter, like, expose a racist cop. And this woman, a white woman who had been pregnant and was expecting a biracial child, her stepfather, her white stepfather, who was a police officer, had called her unborn baby the N-word and texted to her. And so she, the police department looked into it and saw the text. And so there's discipline going on there. But this is a, you know, pervasive problem that isn't going away. And really just seems to be heating up. So why do we care about this? Because we worry that people who hold these types of views, that their views will translate to deeds. Chicago, for those of you who don't know, had one of the worst torture scandals in the nation's history, where Black men who were arrested by police were tortured using cattle prods on their genitals, plastic bags placed over their faces in order to force them to confess. And the officer who led that had some ties to a white supremacist organization. And we also know that, you know, from the DOJ reports about Chicago, that the use of the N-word was completely rampant among police officers in Chicago. That's also true. And the Ferguson report made clear that it was very common for police officers to use the N-word. I included in this bottom corner the Confederate flag shirt that a police officer was wearing under his uniform when he killed an unarmed motorist. A judge excluded that at this officer's trial because he thought it would unfairly inject the issue of race into his trial. And a town called Biscayne, Florida, a police chief wanted perfect stats. So he said, you know, every unsolved case, every open case, let's pin it on a Black person. And that's what they did until another officer shared that. This one really, you know, really gets me. This was a guy who applied to the police department in Little Rock, Arkansas. He was completely honest when he told the HR people when he was applying that he had been to a KKK rally. You can see here the part of his application. And they hired him anyway, knowing that when he was, you know, 18, you know, an adult, or 17, close to an adult, had attended a KKK meeting. And while he was a police officer, not a huge surprise, he killed an unarmed 15-year-old Black child. And so we worry that officers that hold these types of racial animus in their heart, that our community is going to continue to be hurt by police. And so no, this is a surprise, and I have a feeling that Michael German's going to talk about this too. The FBI is warned of white supremacists trying to infiltrate police departments back in 2006, Department of Homeland Security in 2009. There's a recent draft report that apparently seems to have been buried. It's just, we know that this sort of thing is on the rise. So it's no surprise that it's bearing out the way it has. And I think all those text messages, all those Facebook posts, all those emails are really just the tip of the iceberg, right? These are just the officers that are careless enough to post these, to email them. And so this is a really big problem that is only going to get bigger if we don't address it. And so thank you so much for having me. And I'm really happy to be among these other panelists.
Thank you so much, Professor Johnson. That was an in-depth and really honest review of a lot of what we've been trying to cover and get out. Thank you for really validating a lot of the stories that we in our own communities discuss and bringing it to this platform. I really think that what you touched on towards the end was a really great segue into our next panelist, just discussing information that was already known in the FBI and specifically regarding white supremacists and terrorist groups infiltrating the police department. We have with us Michael German, who is a fellow with the Brennan Center for Justice, Liberty, and National Security Program. German was an FBI special agent for 16 years and specialized in domestic terrorism and covert operations. I'm specifically intrigued, Mr. German, by your book, Disrupt, Discredit, and Divide. From what I've seen of it, it has a lot to do with the conversations we're having here. So would you go ahead and just talk to our audience a bit about that? I believe you're muted. Great.
There we go. Hey, I'm not giving a lecture on technology, obviously. That would be very strange. No, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. Basically, I've just recently published a report on this, a lot of it using Professor Johnson's great research on the topic, and particularly the great recommendations that she developed. But basically came to it because when I started out on this topic in the early 1990s, when after an episode of horrible police violence against a Black motorist in Los Angeles sparked a lot of civil disturbance that caused white supremacist groups in Los Angeles to feel that a race war was on the horizon, and they wanted to take action to instigate that violence and to keep it going and develop into a full race war. And I was a young FBI agent at the time, and as one of my colleagues said, you had blonde hair and blue eyes, you can be a Nazi. And asked me to go undercover in his investigation. As we were preparing for it, which was through the auspices of the Joint Terrorism Task Force, so it included several other law enforcement agencies, everyone was quite clear that we had to be very careful with this particular operation because there were people within the law enforcement agencies that we were all working through who had sympathies with white supremacists. And we had to therefore be very careful about who we shared information about the existence of the operation, much less the details of it. So clearly this was a problem that law enforcement recognized. I ended up leaving the FBI in 2004, and into the 2006 report that Professor Johnson referenced came out and verified that those warnings were continuing. And in fact, there's another one in 2015 where it's a counterterrorism policy guide where the FBI warns agents working domestic terrorism investigations against white supremacists and far-right militants that their subjects often have contacts with law enforcement, and instructs them to modify the way that they handle the sharing of information on their investigations. So it's somewhat ironic that we see a lot of people in law enforcement and policymakers and even the media act somewhat surprised by this information that, oh, this was a problem from long ago, not something new. Well, obviously that not just ignores the research that people like Professor Johnson have done and the public examples that we have that she demonstrated in the slides, but also that law enforcement itself knows this is a problem. And I wrote 2 reports documenting the problems with the lack of law enforcement attention to far-right violence and white supremacist violence. The first focused on, called Wrong Priorities on Fighting Terrorism, focused on the federal response. The second focused on the state and local response to hate crimes and why that's so deficient. But for the third report in the trilogy, we were debating on what to talk about when there was a hearing in the House Oversight Committee where Representative Clay asked the FBI Assistant Director for Counterterrorism what the FBI was doing about white supremacist infiltration of law enforcement that was documented in this 2006 FBI report. And the Assistant Director said he had not read the report and wasn't familiar with it, which was just such a punch in the gut that to imagine that this is a person who's responsible not just for protecting the integrity of FBI terrorism investigations, which as a former undercover agent, I understand why that can be important. But what's missing from both that 2006 report, the 2015 counterterrorism guide, and the Assistant Director's testimony is that there is nothing in the FBI's program that talks about how to protect the public from these white supremacist police officers. And that's really the missing element here, that while law enforcement acknowledges that this remains a persistent problem, there is nothing in any public policy that actually specifically addresses this problem. And you can imagine that if there was an FBI report that came out that said Al-Qaeda had influenced you, or it was influencing US law enforcement, that there would be a national response to that issue. There would be a very aggressive effort to identify these people and mute the potential threat that they pose to the public. But somehow there's an attitude, again, not just in law enforcement, broader than that, that thinks having white supremacist police officers is not a problem as long as that number is small and as long as the public doesn't know about it. I mean, in so many of these cases, these are individuals that the police department knew about for some time. And it's only once the public finds out about it that enough attention is brought to the issue that demands that they be fired or otherwise disciplined to protect the community. So that's why on the third report, we went ahead and covered this issue. And I want to point out what I think and credit Professor Johnson for coming up with this is the importance of prosecutors in this role. we've so much depend on police departments to reform themselves and to monitor themselves rather than have independent oversight. But prosecutors have a role here, and they actually have an obligation different from law enforcement about how they handle evidence in court. And by putting these racist officers on Brady lists or no-call lists, where if they're going to be a witness in a case and the prosecution or the law enforcement agency has evidence of their involvement in white supremacist activities or engagement in racist behavior, that needs to be turned over to the defense so we can use the power of our adversarial system to challenge their testimony. So I reiterate that recommendation, and I think that's a really powerful way of going about tackling this problem. And I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Michael. Both you and Professor Johnson's remarks just shows us as a country and just how far we are not removed from the times of racism and racial injustice, especially when you could bring a story to light of what your grandfather experienced when many of our grandfathers are still alive. So these are times just right around the corner where we're experiencing these times today, just, not even as time goes by, but even in today's climate, we're still experiencing these motives that the justice system have upon their underprivileged communities across the nation, so just to hear these stories and these developments that you guys are coming across daily, it's definitely going to make for a remarkable episode on today's topic, which leads right into our next panelist, our final panelist, who plays such a vital, such a needed role right now in today's climate. We're going to introduce Sam Levin, a journalist based out of Los Angeles, working with The Guardian. So this is definitely going to make for a great topic that we're going to discuss when we open up into Q&A. And so, yeah, let's just bring in Sam Levin.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really grateful to be participating in this. And I'm grateful to follow Professor Johnson and Michael German. Both of your guys' work really provides the foundation for the type of reporting I do and provides the context and expertise. And it's always really helpful to have that research. And so I'm really grateful to be here with everyone. I figured I could just tell you all a little bit about what I do and what I report on, and maybe share a little bit about some specific examples of this kind of reporting I've done, just to kind of shed light on specific cases in which we've seen the culture that, Professor Johnson and Mike have described in law enforcement kind of directly impact communities that are most targeted and harmed by police. I consider, my role in all this is, I strive to obviously uncover this type of behavior and uncover systemic racism in law enforcement, as well as, explicit racism by individual officers and departments, and uncover this culture, and then especially shed light on the ways that this impacts real people. And so that work is really all about talking to people who are most impacted by police violence, whether that's the families of people who have been killed by police, people who are in neighborhoods where police are most present and are most targeting people, people who are victims of excessive force, and then activists, protesters, people who are targeted by police in the way that they are prosecuted. And so that's sort of what I do. I'm based in Los Angeles. I'm the LA correspondent for The Guardian, so I cover a wide range of stuff. I figure I could just tell you a little bit about what I've been doing the last couple of years, to give you some background, and then just share a bit about one story I covered that brings to light everything we're talking about today. So in 2016, one of the first assignments I had for The Guardian when we opened up a West Coast bureau here was actually to go out to Eastern Oregon, where there was a sort of right-wing militia takeover of a wildlife refuge. I don't know how much folks remember this, but it was sort of this Oregon militia standoff that was led by Ammon Bundy, who was kind of an anti-government right-wing activist. And I spent some time there covering how that just played out, as well as how police responded to these heavily armed right-wing militia groups staging this protest. And then there was an interesting contrast to that months later when I covered Standing Rock movement, which sort of exploded later that year in North Dakota, of course. And I spent some time there and just witnessed the sort of extremely militarized response by police, as well as the extremely aggressive investigations and prosecutions that followed of Indigenous activists and the water protector movement that was so vital to that moment in history. And then most recently, in the last couple of years, I've been covering anti-fascist, anti-Trump activism across California and across the country, and looking at the different ways that police and prosecutors respond to leftist movements and leftist activists, and contrasting that to the way that police respond to white supremacists, neo-Nazis, pro-Trump groups, et cetera. And so some of that has come in the context of Standing Rock and Keystone, and looking at all these different movements that have bubbled up under Trump. So one story that I covered quite in depth a couple of years ago that I think sheds light on the influence that this culture of policing has on people starts back to a rally that happened in Sacramento, the capital, in June of 2016. So this was during the election, but before Trump had been elected. And this was a rally that was organized by the Traditionalist Worker Party, which is a neo-Nazi white supremacist group. And so there was a very large presence of counter-protesters, kind of like a hodgepodge of different people, anti-fascists, left-wing groups, civil rights groups that showed up to protest the neo-Nazi group. And the rally immediately became violent, and a lot of people on the left were brutally stabbed. And it was quite serious violence. And it was a very sort of big moment in that year in terms of violence breaking out at these kind of increasingly tense rallies. And so I ended up covering this story quite a bit as it actually moved through the court system. And it kind of revealed a lot to me and hopefully to our readers about the ways in which the courts view different groups. And eventually I had obtained some police files from the California Highway Patrol, which was the agency kind of responsible for investigating this. And what the files essentially showed was that CHP investigated the anti-fascists as suspects and treated the neo-Nazis as victims. And that was the frame of the police investigation. And so we saw from, both police records as well as audio from police calls with the neo-Nazi organizers was that the lead investigator for CHP explicitly said to the Traditionalist Worker Party, the white supremacist organizer, that, I'm looking at you as a victim, and we're very much going after them. I'm looking sort of at my old article there, and that was a direct quote. And he worked closely with him to identify some of the anti-fascists in kind of investigating what happened with this violence. And just to take a step back, remember that the people who were injured and hospitalized in this very chaotic situation were the anti-fascists, were these left-wing groups. And so the police files revealed that CHP had done really intense surveillance and monitoring of the social media of these left-wing groups, and had done very little on the flip side of the TWP neo-Nazi group. And so ultimately what happened was police recommended that at least 8 different stabbing victims face criminal charges. And CHP and their police reports, built a case against them by talking about their quote unquote anti-racist views and talking about their, affiliations with Chicano rights groups and indigenous rights groups, and basically recommended very, very serious charges against these people who were victims of quite serious violence. And in recommending kind of assault charges against these anti-fascists, what they were essentially arguing was that the victims in these cases were the neo-Nazis, the people that police were working kind of closely with. And ultimately, there was 3 of them were actually charged by prosecutors there. And there was like 1 minor charge against one of the white supremacists, not for any of the stabbings. And this officer had very kind of closely investigated the anti-fascists, by reviewing their kind of Facebook pages and things like that, and had just sort of done very little research into the neo-Nazis. And, when he was questioned about it on the stand in some hearings that I covered, he just said, I didn't think I needed to. They were the ones who were organizing the rally. I'm paraphrasing, but, effectively arguing that, they had free speech rights to be there, and the people who were violent were the anti-fascists, and they were the criminal suspects I was investigating. And even in his reports where he admitted there was fairly strong evidence about which individuals on the white supremacist side were likely responsible for the violence, for direct stabbings that were caught on camera, he said it's inconclusive, and we can't determine if they should be charged. And so no one was charged for those stabbings. And this case basically dragged on for years. Ultimately, I think it ended with, sort of minor plea deals from some of the anti-fascists who were charged, who agreed to community service for like rioting or some sort of like unlawful assembly. But this was a case that really kind of derailed people's lives for a really long time. And obviously for a lot of these kind of left-wing groups, left people feeling like they had lost a lot of trust in the system, if they had it to begin with. And so that was a case that was really illuminating to me, just looking at the way that police biases, if you could call it that, sort of infiltrate the criminal justice system at every stage. And I've reported on a range of different cases that are similar to that. That's been the one that's sort of most striking to me. I've talked to Mike about it over the years, and we've reviewed some of the documents, and he's given me his feedback as an former FBI expert on just how, some of the shocking realities of the ways in which police are looking at these different sides. But there's been countless examples of this in recent years, whether it's the FBI looking at sort of innocuous left-wing groups or civil rights groups as potential domestic terrorist threats. And in that case, looking at, sort of the KKK as the potential victims, or white supremacists as potential victims. And so this is a pattern that I think we've seen across the country in different places and at different levels of law enforcement and government. So this is not just the FBI under Trump. This is stuff that was happening before Trump. This is stuff that's happening at local police departments, at state agencies in, California, a state that prides itself on being progressive. And, we've certainly seen it recently in Kenosha, where police there definitely displayed some sympathy to the white supremacist or militia groups that showed up. We've seen this just time and time again. And so I think it's important to remember how much this appears to have kind of infected culture across police departments. That's just my very dreary summary of some of the stuff I've reported on, but definitely happy to answer any questions, and, looking forward to having a conversation about all of this stuff.
Thank you, Sam. We will have Stan. Stan was following you.
Yeah, I'm gonna do 2 things. I'm gonna make a statement and ask a question at the same time to the panelists. And this, the statement is, during the Black Lives Matter movements all over the country and all over the world, truly, there's been a lot of activity going on that is anti-productive to the Black Lives Matter movement. A lot of things that have happened, some of the people, I remember one story where African-American male smoking a joint was following an Anglo who was breaking windows, and he was asking him, why are you doing this? Black Lives Matter don't do this. and he went in the guy's face and he said, "Are you a cop?" He actually asked the man, "Are you a cop?" And he was holding a pizza and smoking a joint. He handed his pizza to another individual, and he asked the man once more time, "Are you a cop?" And the man never answered, but continued breaking windows and walking along. I'm going to put my video off for a second. And this is what they look like walking through the protesters. You don't know who they are, and they wear black hats, but they have this mask on like I have right now. It's a fully covered mask. You can't tell who's who, and they're walking through the protesters doing things that Black Lives Matter don't do. And so it was unproductive for them to be there. And then, of course, in the end, later in the evening, the Black Lives Matter protests turned violent. And you had these people running around doing things that they shouldn't have been doing that instigated more violence. So I say that to say this, to ask this, I should say. I recently heard two things. One thing was Orange County sheriffs had been utilizing KKK and different organizations to assist them in stirring up agitation. Also, recently I heard the Sacramento Sheriff's Department was doing the same thing. I don't know if that's true or not, and that's why I'm asking the panel, have they heard anything, especially Sam Levin, have you heard anything about those two agencies being involved in those types of activities? And one more question is, I noticed that the Sheriff's Department seems to be more involved in these kind of activities than city police departments. And I don't know if that's true or not, Sam, but if it is, please iterate on that a little bit. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for bringing all that up. I as it relates to your last question regarding sheriffs, I think we've seen that sheriffs have sort of the least kind of oversight just in the way that they function. So, you know, sheriffs are very unaccountable to anyone. Certainly my frame of reference for that is Los Angeles, where the LA Sheriff's Department that we all probably know a little bit about and have seen in the news quite a bit this summer, and which I've written a lot about, as there's been a string of really shocking and tragic killings, is not really accountable to anyone because of the way that it's structured. So, you know, when you have police departments, they're typically you know, accountable to a mayor or a city council potentially, and there might be some oversight boards. Obviously, there's lots of concerns about police accountability measures in city police departments as well. But sheriffs are elected, which means that the sort of main check on them is an election every 4 years. And with Sheriff Villanueva in LA, I think there were a lot of progressive groups that had supported him based on some promises he made and were sort of hopeful about him. He's gone back on a lot of those promises and has a really sort of troubling track record of, you know, just allowing brutality to continue unchecked. And there have been quite a lot of evidence about actual, you know, organized gang groups within the Sheriff's Department in multiple places that have been directly linked to some of these killings, these tragic killings that have happened. And, you know, the LA Sheriff's Department has a long history of kind of white supremacist activity. And so that is a real concern. And, you know, you've even seen the Board of Supervisors in the last couple of weeks raise concerns about that, and some of them calling on him to resign. And that's what they're doing. And they don't really have much power to do anything about it because of the way that the sheriffs are set up, and the sheriff's police very, you know, large areas. You know, I think that's what makes the LA Sheriff's one of the largest, if not the largest county police agency in the country, is just has this massive jurisdiction over all of these cities and municipalities that aren't covered by LAPD. So I think that does affect the question of accountability. In terms of the question of infiltrators and you know, what role police might play in that, I don't know about the two specific, I just don't know either way. The answer to your question about Orange County or Sacramento, I haven't not followed either of those closely. But I think there's obviously like a long history and reason for activist protesters to be concerned about the police's role in this stuff. And it certainly complicates the dynamics that happen at these protests. But at the end of the day, you know, my sense of things is that both Black Lives Matter and, you know, anti-fascist groups, whatever you would call them or whatever the government calls them, often these are just disparate movements that a lot of different people support. They're not organized. There's not a CEO of, you know, Antifa anywhere, right? And there's no, and so there's really, you know, it's hard to know sort of who's doing what and who's affiliated with what. And that's obviously a challenge, and makes it very concerning when you have, you know, the federal government come out and designate a whole group of people potential terrorists, because of the way that that can include a lot of people in that. And then just the last thing I'll say, I know I'm kind of rambling on, is that there is also reason for people to be suspicious of potential undercover activity by police. I mean, I think we fairly recently saw in Los Angeles that there was an undercover LAPD officer who had basically infiltrated a pretty innocuous, like anti-Trump protest organizing, like I think right after he was inaugurated. And it was, I don't remember the exact details. It was one of the first things I reported on when I moved to LA. But there were recordings of an officer there basically being like, hey guys, you know, how are we protesting today? Or like, it was almost like comical, except it's obviously not comical because this is used to prosecute people. And so there's reasons to be, and you know, that's what happens when you have undercover police doing this kind of work, is that it seeds mistrust within these organizing spaces. And certainly that was a huge issue at Standing Rock, where there was a lot of undercover activity and then a lot of distrust of people because of fears that they were police there to prosecute people, which ultimately some of them were there to collect evidence that was used to bring very, very serious charges against people.
Would any of our other panelists like to add on or address Stan's question?
I could just add some details to the first example in Minneapolis of the man in a mask breaking windows. There later was about a little more than a month after that event, a search warrant application filed by the local police indicated they had received a tip that it was a member of a white supremacist motorcycle gang who had done that. And it turned out that shortly after the event, the FBI had released a bulletin that described a lot of the different issues, but buried in there was the information that white supremacists were going to the Black Lives Matter protests to instigate violence. And, you know, I think it's absolutely correct that the breaking of the windows was intended to spread further violence. And the police affidavit for the search warrant on the member of the motorcycle gang mentioned that building where this person allegedly broke the windows was the first building to be lit on fire that first evening after the George Floyd murder. So, you know, particularly when we have a president and an attorney general who are trying to blame every bad thing on Antifa, and even, you know, deeply through law enforcement, as we've seen with a lot of the law enforcement intelligence reports coming through the blue leaks, coming to the public through the blue leaks. There is this conspiracy theory, for lack of a better word, that blames every bad thing on this amorphous Antifa that is a broad enough term to include everybody you don't like and exclude anybody you do like, rather than actually looking at what evidence exists and following that evidence. And the only thing I point out is that although that search warrant application was made public, I'm not aware that any arrest was made as a result of that situation.
I guess I'll just add, I mean, you know, when you think about what we tell children police are there to do, right? To protect and to serve. And yet you have these police officers who are doing the things that Sam and Michael just described. I mean, they're actually limiting and interfering with the population that they're there to protect and serve, their ability to express themselves through peaceful protests. And obviously, you know, and I mean, and really that's just a little thing when you think about all the brutality and the corruption and all the other issues with law enforcement. But I think in some ways that's the most scary to me, that, you know, the kind of influence that they have over people exercising just their day-to-day lives.
Thank you so much for each of your perspectives on this. We've got a couple of questions here from our students as well, and our other guests. So one of these questions here, they want to know if the organization Blue Lives Matter has changed the culture of police departments. Is it appropriate for BLM, Blue Lives Matter, to be associated with what the badge represents, which is sacrifice, duty, and service? In addition, can Blue Lives Matter be a disguise for white supremacists and militia infiltration within departments? And what can organizations do to combat this if Blue Lives Matter is a real issue? Would our panelists like to answer?
I'll just say, I think the Blue Lives Matter movement is something that really just sows discord between the communities that police are there to serve, and police. It really fosters this like us against them mentality that really isn't productive. I mean, they're literally public servants. That's their goal. Like if we should be able to fire police that don't serve our goals because they work for us. Yet, you know, that's not the way the police see themselves. And I think that's the sort of the problem, that sort of the place that we're at. You know, I tell a story about dropping my daughter off after that horrible school shooting in Connecticut, and for the first time in my life being happy to see the police at my daughter's preschool. And just this idea that there's a whole segment of population that sees police completely differently than I have, and just this, there's just this us against them mentality that is counterproductive. Anyway, that was a little rambly, but yeah, others.
And I totally agree with that. And I think further, it's very dangerous to police, right? I mean, one of the things that has shocked me about the apparent affinity that some police officers are showing for these far-right militants that show up at these protests across the country is that far-right militants kill police officers. You know, if you look at who gets killed by these groups, they often target police. And that was well understood when I was working undercover, of course, because we had the Ruby Ridge incident and the Waco incident, and it was very clear who they targeted. So to see this friendliness and acceptance and welcoming of these militants to these protests is really problematic. And, you know, something like, you know, and you have to understand these militants are really good at propaganda. You know, they are constantly recreating ourselves. Professor Johnson mentioned that one group that has changed its name, Identity Europa, over to the American Identity Movement. You know, that they're constantly trying to hide from what they actually are from their public image. And so, you know, to make it as easy as one of these militants putting on a Blue Lives Matter patch or flying a Blue Lives Matter flag and showing up at a Blue Lives Matter rally to make believe he's friendly with the police, I'm astonished that law enforcement doesn't recognize that for what it is. And it's somewhat explicit. In Portland, the police chief was giving a talk after these far-right militants most recently came into town in broad daylight, shooting people indiscriminately with pepper balls or paintballs and spraying bear mace everywhere and just physically attacking people in broad daylight, the police chief, as an excuse for not doing anything, said, well, you know, if we try to intervene in that situation, it will only escalate the violence. So they recognize that these people present a violent threat, and they're saying, we're not going to stop them from attacking the public because then they might attack us, right? And yet somehow they're not at all offended by escalating the violence against unarmed protesters after the far-right militants leave. So if you look, since the George Floyd protests have started, 2 police officers have been killed. They were killed by far-right militants. And there's even an effort, you see politicians in DC will refer to the Boogaloo movement adherents, which is a far-right militant movement, who did those homicides, as they're being rebranded as anarchists. They're trying to pretend that that incident was the Black Lives Matter protesters or the so-called Antifa or anarchists, rather than what it is. So, you know, if law enforcement itself is being misled either by this militant group propaganda or by the politicization of the issue by our politicians, it's law enforcement that's going to suffer ultimately, and they're going to put, you know, I don't like making recommendations or predictions, but I would think there's going to be far more violence against law enforcement in the future from these groups.
Just one very quick point to add also is that I think we've seen over and over again is that when you have police officers in recent protests who have been wearing either Blue Lives Matter logos or the thin blue line masks or something, obviously inflame tensions at these Black Lives Matter protests. I mean, Blue Lives Matter came as a direct response to a movement that said Black lives should matter and be, you know, treated equally. And so it's hard not to expect that it will make people angry when police officers, after they kill someone, then show up at these rallies, basically mocking a movement to defend Black lives. And we've definitely seen that in LA. And I think there were some examples of that in San Francisco as well, and I'm sure other places. And that certainly has caused increased tensions.
Thank you, Michael and Sam. And Michael, I think one of the things that we need to talk about too in the future is the differential of Boogaloo, Antifa, and all the different organizations, because, you know, we're being led to believe that this one's doing this when that one's doing this, and vice versa. And so that might be a conversation for the future. I need to respond to a question, anonymous attendee. Was there evidence that the individual wearing the mask, breaking windows, was in fact a police officer? Were you trying to imply that he was? Didn't an officer in Northern California just get in trouble for making baseless claims that Antifa was starting forest fires? And the reason why I asked the question and I mean made the statement in form of a question is because I wasn't aware whether he was a peace officer or not, and Michael answered the question very well. And as far as the Northern California thing, anybody on the panel wish to address that?
Go ahead.
I haven't followed super closely. My colleague Jason Wilson, who I recommend everyone follow, who's also an expert on this stuff and more so than me in Oregon especially, has been covering what's been happening with false rumors regarding Antifa's role in the fires. And what he's found in his reporting is that, you know, you have seen local police departments that have been fueling the flames of these false rumors, which is obviously just incredibly dangerous. And you've seen these rumors spread really far and have really serious consequences. People setting up, you know, roadblocks to question people about whether they belong. Jason, my colleague, I think was reporting on one example of a Black woman who was driving home who was basically stopped by this unauthorized roadblock questioning whether she belonged there. And this is during a national disaster. And so the fact that this stuff this disinformation spreads so rapidly is hugely terrifying, and particularly during a fire catastrophe, and obviously unacceptable for people who are, taxpayer-funded law enforcement agencies to be spreading false rumors meant to discredit leftist movements is a very scary development that has happened at this current moment.
And I would second that about Jason. He does a lot of great work up there. And another is Alice Sperry of The Intercept, who, you have to understand again how this term Antifa is no longer representing anti-fascism. It's this sort of phrase that these, both the far-right militants and the police and the Trump administration are using to identify all of their enemies. It's this amorphous thing, so much so that Alice Sperry wrote a piece for The Intercept where a Portland police officer accused the local district attorney of being Antifa because he had dismissed charges against protesters who were arrested on any charge that didn't involve the use of violence or a threat against the police. So if assistant district attorneys are also part of this Antifa mob that we're worried about, we're in trouble because we're all going to fall under that umbrella at some point.
Thank you. Right before we continue on in the Q&A, I did want to make notice to our panelists that if there's any upcoming events that you hold dear to your heart, or any way that our attendees and guests may be able to follow the great work that you're doing, please post in the chat for them. Oftentimes our attendees do like to follow up and continue to pursue the work that you guys are doing also. So we do want to say thank you for your additions on today's show. Just moving along in the show, I wanted to, because earlier we mentioned, officers' will to protect and serve their communities. I wanted to unpack what it means to protect and serve. When transparency and communication is at an all-time low in our judicial system and government, when officers hide behind this veil of policing and what it means to protect and serve, it seems that their honor is amongst each other, protect and serve each other's beliefs and views to make sure that their brethren make it home at night. But, and we talk about it a lot on this show where officers oftentimes, if not all the time, serve in communities that they don't necessarily live in, so that sparks a fear in an officer that goes into an unknown territory to protect and serve, so to speak. And you can see the traumas that these families are left with following, calling law enforcement to handle a certain situation that may get out of control for themselves, but they're just left with the turmoil of what the officers done when they've arrived. Oftentimes leading us to, never want to use emergency calling again in these instances. So how do we, so to speak, repair this relationship between law enforcement and community? Also, especially when it comes to media, media, just the subject line itself, oftentimes put the people at harm, and in a sense of rage, without even reading the article itself, but just the subject line that the media uses oftentimes says to lead that, we're just in troubling times. We're in troubling times, and this is almost in a sense of this is just where we are. This is just how it is. This is what it's going to be. And when we see the failure of our judicial system in many of these cases, we can name them all. We can name them in alphabetical order. When we see the failures that these prosecutions on these officers in these wrongdoings, how do we repair that? What does it really mean to protect and serve? And who are we protecting? Who are they protecting? Who are they serving?
I wanted to, from what Marlo had to say, sort of pose a question to our panelists. I'm going to go ahead and reach back maybe from a few episodes. So from what you've all been discussing, it seems that what these terrorist groups, what these infiltrating groups have in common is that they are nationalistic about white supremacy, and that they are also militant. And we talk a little bit about, you also brought up, Professor Johnson, just some parallels between police departments and the military. And we have talked about in previous episodes, the militarization of police departments. So I want to know, from your perspectives, what are the possibilities if we decrease militarization in the police department, if we put more of our funding towards officers who are actually social workers and don't just carry around a gun? How does that reshape the culture of these white supremacists and terrorist groups within the police department? Does it reshape it? Does it affect it at all?
I think these are such great questions that you guys are asking, Marlo and Yvette, and I think, you know, you could do multiple episodes on just some of the ideas for solutions. One solution that I thought was really interesting is one that my colleague Paul Butler posed, which is we should make police departments all female. I mean, it would just be a really different thing, right? I mean, obviously there's a lot of reasons that we can't and won't do that, but there's just so many fixes that could be attempted, but seemingly in a lot of places, very little will to make those changes. Marlo mentioned a really good one, which is requiring that people who are policing community live in those communities, and that's not the case in a lot of police departments. I mean, I would be surprised if more than 10% of the Washington, D.C. police officers lived in Washington, D.C. They live in Virginia and Maryland, and sometimes really far-flung parts. I was a public defender in D.C. for a long time, and I talked to an officer who commuted from Pennsylvania. I mean, he doesn't know our community, doesn't necessarily reflect our values in the same way. And so I think these are some fixes or some potential ways to change the culture. I would think you would see a little bit less of an us against them mentality with police officers. When you know a community, you're less likely to see it as a threat. But there's so much, I mean, there's so much that needs to be done.
I mean, I'm not an activist, I'm a journalist, obviously, and I report on what people are saying. And I guess just one thing I'll respond to with both of those questions is that, you know, as I spend a lot of time talking to victims of police violence, especially recently in the sort of post-George Floyd months, you are hearing a lot of the sort of rallying cry of defunding police as the answer to this moment. And I certainly, in Los Angeles, when we're talking about the sheriff's department, spent a lot of time this summer with some families of recent victims, as also ones who've been fighting for changes for years, people who've been killed by sheriff's deputies. And the support for defunding or even dismantling the sheriff's department you hear from them comes from the recognition that the kind of efforts at reforms haven't worked, which, you know, we can see based on just the reality that police keep killing people in incredibly egregious ways. You know, when police have received body cameras, largely what happens then is that the brutality is caught on camera, and we don't really see consequences as a result. Our system generally approves of the use of lethal force, just based on the way policing and our courts are set up. And I think there's sort of countless examples of sensitivity training, bias training, all sorts of like the sort of most classic reforms that have not stopped these very tragic and shocking killings from happening, as well as obviously brutality and excessive force that we've seen with our own eyes, whether it's from cell phone camera or from body camera footage. And so I think for some, you know, and certainly this is not how everyone feels, but for some of the folks that I've talked to, this is what they're pushing, which is that, you know, if police can't be reined in and can't treat our communities respectfully and police us fairly, then we should take their power and their funding away, right? And I think that idea, when I talk to folks about it, comes from the recognition that police don't kind of bring safety or protection to their communities in the first place, kind of to the question you were asking, Marlo, which was just that, like one daughter of an older man who was killed by the sheriffs this summer that almost got no attention, this man, Michael Thomas, who was basically killed in his house when police were called for what they thought was allegedly a domestic violence call, but he was unarmed and police basically barged in and ended up killing him. She was like, I grew up not calling the police. I don't call the police. I know that police don't protect me. Police, in the Lancaster area of, North LA County, like police aren't there for me. And so I think you could defund the police today immediately, and all it would do would be lead, to more safety for my community, which is stopped on the street by them and potentially killed by them, in just minor traffic stops and things like that. And so obviously it's an incredibly complicated question, but I do think you're hearing more mainstream interest in those ideas or in just abolition as a framework to think about this. And it's something that as a journalist, I'm very interested in exploring and thinking about, because there are a lot of folks who have thought a lot about it, and it seems like an important place to place some energy. Yeah.
And I would just add, I think there, a lot of what drives the us and them division is this impression of how dangerous it is to be a police officer in the United States. And in fact, this era is one of the safest eras ever in the United States to be a police officer. The numbers are down to literally record lows over the last several years in police officers feloniously killed in the line of duty. And in fact, this year, what has killed more police officers than all other things combined, including car accidents, which is usually the leading cause of death for police officers, is COVID. But you don't hear law enforcement having a great campaign to do more against the virus, right? So it's this focus on what should be a good news story about, less violence against the police, flipping that into, if you ask police officers, they feel like you said, that the chances of me coming home tonight are at risk. So of course, if they're being trained that way, they're going to go out and treat everybody as a potential threat to them personally, and it's much harder to do the job in any kind of, or to even view a circumstance in any way except in any kind of an objective way, except through this prism of, is this person going to harm me, with the assumption that they will if you let them. And correcting that attitude, I think, is going to be extremely difficult because, we're in this environment where everybody's in their own conspiracy vortex with Antifa or whatever, that anybody who challenges your worldview isn't providing another viewpoint, but rather showing themselves to be part of the conspiracy against you. So it's going to be really hard to change this. And one of the ways that I think it shows is, obviously the video of George Floyd being slowly smothered to death over 8.5 minutes sparked even law enforcement leaders to come out and say, this was horrible and needs to be punished. We don't do this. This isn't what's trained. But if you look at the arrests that they've been making during the protests, it's all the same. 3 or 4 officers throwing a person violently to the ground who's not threatening to them, and then everybody leaning their full weight on them. So they're obviously receiving this training because it's happening all over the country. So who's training them if it's not these law enforcement leaders who are saying this isn't part of our training? As an FBI agent, the way I was taught to arrest somebody was to walk up to them on a public street, stick out my hand and say, "Hi, I'm Mike." And when they shake my hand, put a handcuff on it. And and that's it, right? It's game over. You've caught them by surprise, and it's too late for them to react violently. And the more force that you bring to trying to arrest somebody, the more resistance you're going to give. And that's in any situation, right? You don't have to be a police officer in some subject of an investigation. If you go up and push somebody, you're going to get pushed, you're going to get a reaction, right? You know, it's just human nature. And yet police are abandoning that training that was all through the 80s and 90s and come up with this warrior cop training as an alternative that has only created the problems that we're seeing. And yet I don't see any strong movement within law enforcement to change that training.
Or to hold those officers accountable for that use of force as well. Oftentimes, because you hit it right on the head when you said they're abandoning their training. I remember once upon a time when nationally, the topic around police was not getting paid enough. You know, their wages weren't equal to the risk that they take daily as an officer. And it seemed like almost immediately following that topic were these unarmed, innocent lives being taken by law enforcement. So it comes to a question that I hate to ask, but it just circles around in my mind. Are officers looking for a paid vacation, so to speak, nationally, you know, by taking a life and they get paid time off and no justice is sought in these cases? I mean, it almost seems fathomable to almost suspect that it's almost a life for a vacation.
So I think I would push back against that idea for a couple of reasons. One is that, you know, I think that it's more, not sure how to really explain this. You know, I think the majority of law enforcement officers are trying to do what they see as the right thing, but it's kind of the question you ask, who do you serve, right? We tend to view white supremacy and even racism as this extremist viewpoint out on the fringes of our society that every once in a while leaks into mainstream society. That's not what it is, right? Our nation was founded as a white supremacist project. I mean, literally, you know, European colonization was a white supremacist project. And people in law enforcement up through the Jim Crow era and the era of sundown towns was to enforce white supremacist laws. I mean, that's what they did. There was no question about it. It wasn't a matter of implicit or explicit bias. The law says people of color can't be in this city after sundown, and I'm going to enforce that law by force if necessary. So, you know, we have to remember that this wasn't a long time ago, right? I mean, gosh, that's the second time I forgot the author of a book on sundown towns that's recently been published. His initials are DL. I'm horrible with names. But, you know, he was writing about sundown towns that existed through the 1970s, and not just in the Deep South, across the country. And I think understanding that police officers are protecting who they're trained to protect, and that tends to be property owners and the property that they own. And then you add on this counterterrorism mission that we've given to state and local law enforcement officer with this concept of critical infrastructure. Well, what's critical infrastructure? The stuff powerful people own. And we've now turned police, and Sam writes about this and his other colleagues at The Guardian quite a bit, into where they feel more comfortable interacting with, to protect powerful industries, the oil and gas industry, the banking industry, rather than to protect members of the public. And so their framing is just bent from what we imagine protect and serve is supposed to mean.
Also, to sort of quickly respond to Marlo's question, I do think, not that, you know, officers going to take a life to get a vacation, but I do think that police unions are so strong and have allowed so many benefits for police officers, everything from hiding their discipline, being able to cover their badges in some instances, and our local governments have negotiated with these unions in order to not pay them, to serve as a, as they're trying to negotiate salary, they'll offer these other benefits that allow police to have incredible pensions, incredible protections from termination. I mean, that officer who I showed, who had the Nazi stuff tattooed on his arm, I mean, he was like a legit Nazi, and he was not fired because the police union was able to protect him. And they pointed out that he didn't fight. There was no tattoo rule on file with the Philadelphia Police Department. So it's just, that's another thing that we really need to address. So, well, Sam is absolutely right that like defunding is part of it, but part of it is like also defunding some of the power away from these police unions when cities and states negotiate with them. Because, I'm not anti-union, but like that's a union that has too much power, and we've given it to them.
Thank you, Professor Johnson. That was much needed, bringing up the police unions. That's another huge topic that needs to be dealt with as well during this time, and one that we overlooked, one that I definitely overlooked recently as well. We still have Q&As coming in, and thank you guys for still attending. We'll be wrapping up shortly. I think we have enough time for one more question before we get into closing remarks. So I do want to thank my panelists for staying in with the topic, and thank you attendees for remaining strong in the questions bar. I do see a question coming in from Joseph Lake. Is it common in law enforcement or FBI training to constantly treat everyone as a potential threat? And how did Michael negotiate that during his time as an agent?
Yeah, I think police officers are, I don't know why there's echo, but police officers are trained to treat everyone as a potential threat. I mean, you can just see it in their body language, in the way that they're trained to approach people with their body bladed. So if somebody shot, it would be a smaller target. And, these kinds of tactics that they're just trained in. And, there are certain situations where that's entirely appropriate. I wanted to be an FBI agent from the time I was a little kid. So I grew up reading everything that I could possibly read about the FBI. And of course, in the 1970s, when I was growing up, there was this little thing called the Church Committee that did a deep investigation of the FBI and all the problematic programs it had targeting civil rights leaders and anti-war activists. So I think having that historical knowledge going into the FBI about what the tendencies, the institutional tendencies of this organization were, and looking at the reforms that were implemented as not just necessary to adequately protect the civil liberties of innocent people, but to make my job as an actual law enforcement officer more effective. As I used to explain to young agents, the standards that we were given, reasonable indication of criminal activity, probable cause, were standards to make us more effective. Right? That if I can't sit down with a piece of paper and write all the reasons why I think this person I'm investigating has done something wrong, there's probably somebody doing worse things out there. It's not as if we're in a crime-free society, which goes to the other question about what police do. Half of the violent crime in this country goes unsolved. That includes almost 40% of the murders in this country go unsolved, the most serious kind of crime. 40% of them don't get solved. And it's more than 64% of the rapes that are reported to the police, and we know that there's an underreporting problem, are not closed in investigations. So, we have to understand that there's no need for law enforcement to go out searching for some imaginary threat on the margins of society. If they're interested in doing that mission of protecting and serving the communities they are sworn to protect and serve, there's a lot for them to do right there. But unfortunately, they're looking for future threats rather than working on what they actually know. And, you know, I think working undercover helped me a lot because everybody was a threat when you're doing that kind of work, and knowing that the last thing you can do is look like you think anybody is a threat made me sort of look through a very different prism, and how, and also to know really people who had done very bad things personally sort of gives you a different perspective too, that, you know, this idea that people are good or evil, well, you know, I think there's a little bit of good and a little bit of evil in all of us, and sometimes make people who do really good things make really bad choices in certain circumstances. And if you look at these crime problems that way, it's a lot easier to come up with solutions that are more humane.
Getting back on the subject, the KKK in the police departments, also, how does that relate to just plain racism in the police departments? Any of the panelists?
Since that's the title of my article, I thought maybe I should jump in, but I think it's all connected. I think, you know, there are, you know, people who identify as white supremacists on police departments, but I think that's probably a small number. I think there are, and I should just say, there are people in my family that are police. Like, I don't think all police are terrible people. I think a lot of people become police officers to protect their community because it can be a good job. But there's another segment, apart from the people who are good and the ones that are white supremacists, who are, have these beliefs that are in line with white supremacy, even if they don't consider themselves white supremacists. And those are the people who have these biases they hold, even though they can't name them. And so, you know, those, I think that's very common. I think implicit bias is very common amongst all of us. So, you know, we know that if that's true of every one of us, Black, white, we know that's definitely true of police departments there where, you know, whites are overrepresented. There are more white people on police departments that are reflected in the community. And so I think we just know there's a lot of racism on police departments in a lot of different shapes and forms.
Thank you for that question, Stan, and thank you for your addition to that, Professor Johnson. Another question I wanted to ask came from our audience before we get out of here tonight, that you guys can answer, all of our panelists, you can answer, all our hosts if you would like to as well. If you were in charge of hiring new officers, what characteristics and skills would you look for that will represent the change you have all expressed? And that's a question coming in from Jerry in the audience. If you had a chance to hire new officers, what would be your perfect candidate?
I'll just say that I probably can't answer that question just as a journalist. Like, I don't know if it's really, there's much I could say about that. So
definitely. I mean, if I could.
Can I just say, Marlo, sorry, yeah. Vida, you go ahead, please.
I would just say, having never worked in a police department, I'm probably not the right person to ask. But, you know, I would like someone with training in emergency mental health crises.
I think there's been some scholarship, though, that says that the organization makes the person. So you can hire someone who is, you know, like Michael was. He was, you know, enthusiastic about being an FBI agent and from by all accounts did a great job. But until we change the goals of policing, the goals of the criminal justice system, we're always going to have, you know, these folks who are created in the academies, you know, where they learn all of the procedures for law enforcement, but then you get in a patrol car, your first day of training, and your training officer says, okay, forget about all that stuff you learned in the academy. We're gonna go out here and kick some butt. And so it proceeds from there. And the fact that police departments, and as Vida pointed out, unions are tolerant of that action. You know, I don't think training is the problem. You know, police officers can patrol white communities with very little problem. And as someone said recently, I want the white treatment by police officers. I don't want the black treatment. I want the white treatment. And you know, that just says that there is not a training that so much as a response by these police departments and the city councils and the boards of supervisors. And I'm thinking of LA Sheriff, you know, who has just gotten to be obnoxious, just really obnoxious. And so it has to start, you know, I'm a social scientist. So it has to start from the systemic, institutional level. You know, that's never, you know, I am a professor in an institution that has rules that I gotta go by, that I have got to comply with. And if I don't, then there are consequences to that. And I think that's the same thing in any organization, most especially in policing, because Stan can walk out of his house, Marlo can walk out of his house and be killed. And that's just the reality of it. You know, so I think that, and as we saw today with Brianna, you know, there are no consequences to that. And so the more police officers do things like that and see that, hey, I'll get a slap on the wrist, I'm good. I can go out there and see everybody in South Central LA as my enemy. And I can enforce that. And I even see my own fellow police officers who are not white, I see them as my enemy too. And so I think it has to start, you know, legislation, and all of the people that we hire to take care of us, that we vote in to take care of us. They are not doing an adequate job of you know, they're writing the checks for police officers.
Right.
The unions don't write checks. The cities and the counties write checks for the police officers. You hold back a few checks, I think there's going to be some change.
I think that's right. And, you know, I mean, I think that there are small things, obviously hiring more diverse workforce and promoting more diverse police leaders. Law enforcement across the country remains a predominantly white profession. The FBI is still overwhelmingly white, 84% white, 80% male. You look at the attitudes of white males in this country, and that's going to be a pretty clear picture of what these agencies look like. You know, obviously hiring a more educated workforce, I think residency requirements, like what Professor Johnson mentioned, are helpful. But, you know, like I said, everybody has a little bit of good and a little bit of evil in them. And if you hire somebody who has done good throughout their life, it doesn't mean they can't turn around and do something very bad. So really what's most critical, and I think most missing, is oversight of police. You know, police enjoy and whether it's because of the union protection, but even that the way unions are protected, I think it shows the problem is that, you know, politicians are afraid of making the police subordinate to the public will. And, you know, particularly in this concept of defunding police and, you know, training police in social or mental health response, mental crisis response. I don't think that's ever going to work, right? You know, so much of police training is antithetical to how a mental health professional would approach somebody. So I think we just have to take that effort, you know, and as much as the police are offended by the concept of defunding the police, part of the problem is we've already defunded mental health services, we've defunded social services, and just laid all that in the lap of the police. And usually when I talk to police officers, they would love to have that responsibility taken away from them. They don't want to be responding to a call of somebody in a mental health crisis. They don't know what to do when they get there. And they don't have the tools to address that situation. So what we have to do is make this a whole of society reform, that we're actually building back that social safety net that will be responsive to people in crisis. I mean, even if you're lucky enough to have very good insurance, you know, the chances of you getting a quick meeting with a trained psychologist are pretty small. You know, if you're having a crisis this week and need to talk to somebody this weekend, good luck. You know, there are places in this country where the closest psychologist is 300 miles away. You know, we have a serious problem that we're not addressing, and that's, I think, being dumped on the police, who don't handle it well because they're not trained to handle it well.
And just one quick sort of data point or just example of the ways in which the culture is so entrenched, I think, is when you look at cases of police officers who do become whistleblowers, who do try to speak out, who are sort of the kinds of officers that we would hope are the ones in power, or, you know, trying to make a difference. I think we've seen examples, and there's certainly a lot of ongoing controversy now with whistleblowers in the sheriff's office in Los Angeles, where there are folks who are trying to do the right thing and shine light on, you know, violence or racism within the department, brutality. And in those cases, those officers have often been forced to sue the department to try to bring change, and are not really getting support from the top, certainly, and are now, in some cases, potentially in fear for their own lives type of situation. And so I think, you know, just looking at the ways in which the officers who do try to do the quote unquote right thing, whatever that might be in a specific situation, and some of the struggles that they face, is just another helpful way to look at how these are broader systemic problems, as everyone is saying today.
Yeah, I think all the answers were you take a culmination of all the answers and put it together, and you still would be confused about who that perfect officer is. My brother John, who passed away, his son and my grandson, all three of them are peace officers. And I think the diversity, the living in the town that you serve and protect, all those things can help. And to answer one of the questions, Eddie Bryan, I'm not going to mess up his last name, but he says, you know, he's a bouncer at a bar, and he says, by knowing everybody that comes to the bar, he knows who the troublemakers are and who the good people are, and so he can do his job very, very well. And I think that's a big thing. And I don't know when living in the city you serve became a bad thing. I was a firefighter for 34 years, and I spent the majority of my time living in the city I served. And it wasn't a bad thing. You know, I might have got my door knocked down a couple of times by my neighbors to help me out with this and that and the other. But at some time, for peace officers, living in the city they serve has turned into a negative. And I don't know why and when that was, but I think it's a sad thing, because if you know your people that you serve, you know who the bad ones are, who the good ones are, you know who's turning bad, and maybe you can save them. There's a lot of things that can happen by you being a part of your environment.
Well, LAPD and other California police departments tried that a few years ago, and they actually sued because they did not want to live in the city. They said it was unconstitutional. Of course, the union had a lot to do with that decision by the legislature, but by law, we cannot require residency by our police officers in the city in which they patrol, which is, you know, you can't do it with the governor. Governor can't live in Oklahoma. governor has to live in California, right? So it's you know, the legislature's on the side of law enforcement. Because there's this, as we've spoken about in our other panels, there's this mystique about policing that we get from television and dime novels and that kind of thing. So we can't do it in California, and there's nothing wrong with it. I think I see that it's the right thing to do, Stan, but I think that we just can't do it in California. Can we answer that, have Sam answer that very last question before we sign off, Marlo? I think it's a really important question, and I think that even, yeah, it's which LAPD or LA County Sheriff's Department story has stuck out the most to you and why?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, I mean, they all stick with me in different ways, of course. I think most recently, I was very disturbed by the story I mentioned briefly earlier of the killing of a man named Michael Thomas, who is 61 years old, in Lancaster by the Sheriff's Department. And part of what's disturbing about it is that there was not much attention to it. Some people listening now might know that name, but I would imagine maybe a majority don't. I guess I don't really have a sense, but it certainly was not a viral hashtag like some of the other killings that have happened, or even Dijon Kazib, the most recent, or one of the most recent sheriff killing victims. And so it's, you know, talking to a family of someone who does not get the attention is always a painful experience, and is always very sort of moving, because it just knowing what has happened to your loved one, and that there's really not sort of a mass movement necessarily for justice is a hard thing. And then the circumstances of what actually happened were just very disturbing. Someone killed inside his own home, someone who was armed. And the Sheriff's Department does not have body cameras right now. There's been an ongoing fight about it, but the reality is that we'll never see, you know, what happened there, and ultimately all the family has is police's narrative. And, you know, the Sheriff's Department has a pretty documented record of spreading false and misinformation about what's happened in these killings and changing their story. And so that really just sort of stuck with me. And one thing his daughter said to me was something along the lines of just like, I begged the Sheriff's Department to even just let me just anonymously talk to the officer, just so I could just ask him, like, what happened, please. I just need to know what happened in the final moments of, you know, my father's death. And that really just stuck with me, because there's no answers that come after that. And in some ways, a family like that will never sort of get answers, especially when there's such sort of little pressure, and when it's an agency that doesn't have a lot of oversight. But yeah, they all stick with me in different ways.
Thank you, Sam. Oftentimes there aren't any answers following those, and just traumas left with the families for the remaining time. Myself and I'm sure our guests and attendees wish we had more time to pick your brains for such expertise, such knowledge on these topics today, guys. On behalf of our series organizers, we just want to thank you, Sam, Vida, Michael, just for your insight today. And I guess they really spiked that Q&A button today. So we I don't know, maybe in the future we can get you guys back and have more insight on this. This is just such a powerful topic, and so much concern and communication that we can have on this issue itself. So I want to respect everyone's time. I want to close. I want to just say thank you to my co-host, Stan. He's president of our Westside Action Group here in San Bernardino, an organization from my outside looking in, just holds the city's leaders, elected officials accountable and responsible for leading our city into greater economic growth and quality of life here in San Bernardino. So I just want to thank you, Stan, as well as Yvette, my co-host Yvette, a part of our Associated Student Incorporated, on a special projects team over there, doing great work as well. And all of our background team, you know who you are. I'll be seeing you guys in a post meeting shortly. But again, guys, just thank you for your insight today. I couldn't imagine a greater team to give us this insight as well. So as we close out, I want to say good night, guys, and everyone else, all of our attendees. We'll see you same time next week for conversations on race and policing, 4 p.m. Wednesdays, guys. A very special episode coming up next. So thank you, guys. I can't thank you enough.
Thank you so much for having us. This was great. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks a lot.
Bye, everyone. Be well.
Bye, everyone.
Have a good one.